There are no rights, technically speaking, without responsibilities. And all we've had for 60 years is a dialogue about rights. Well, that leaves a hole on the other side of the story. There's been this attempt to identify masculine competence and power, let's say, but mostly competence with tyranny.
The problem is toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity.
And that's very, very hard on young men. It's also hard on young women, for that matter. But it's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world.
Competent and dangerous? Why dangerous?
Because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak.
How is it good to be dangerous?
Because it makes you formidable. And life is a very difficult process, and it's not for, you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order, right? And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea. Because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous.
From Vox, you've claimed feminists have an unconscious wish for brutal male domination.
You tell me why they line up with the Islamists.
Because they line up with the Islamists, and not all do, they just haven't criticized them.
Well, that's good enough for me. You know, you'd think if the feminists practiced what they'd preached, there'd be non-stop demonstrations against Saudi Arabia.
Saudi women, they still cannot get married, travel abroad, or open a bank account without permission of a male guardian.
You say compassion is a vice?
If it's taken too far, you don't treat adult men as if they're infants. You don't divide the world into victim and oppressor, and then assume that all the moral virtues on the side of the so-called victims. It's an extension of the infant predator narrative, as far as I can tell. Now, you're either an infant or a predator. Well, that's just not a good way of conceptualizing the political world. There's an entire, literature, psychoanalytic literature on the dangers of overcompassion, hyperprotectiveness, helicopter parenting, all of that. When you have children, you have to encourage them. You have to encourage them to take risks because they have to grow up and take their place in the world. You can't protect them too much because if you do, you destroy them. That's the motif of Hansel and Gretel, right? Two kids lost in the woods. They find the gingerbread house. That's a little bit too good to be true. Right? It's not only shelter when you need it, but it's candy. What lives inside the house that's too good to be true? The witch that devours you, right? That's excess compassion. So you don't want your mother to do everything for you, that's for sure. There's a rule if you're dealing with the elderly in like extended care homes. Don't do anything for your clients that they can do themselves because you undermine their autonomy. And so there's a certain amount of harshness that goes along with that, just as there is if you're a good mother, because you have to separate yourself from your child and allow them to make hurtful mistakes, right? I mean, it's very difficult if you're a compassionate person to stand back far enough to let your children take necessary risks.
But one thing I'm not getting, there's a big difference between letting people do something for themselves and saying men should be dangerous. By dangerous, that implies I should be ready to threaten someone, to hurt somebody.
No, you should be capable of it. But that doesn't mean you should use it. There's nothing to you otherwise. Like if you're not a formidable force, there's no morality in your self-control. If you're incapable of violence, not being violent isn't a virtue. People who teach martial arts know this full well, right? If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously you learn to control it. Both of those come together. And the combination of that capacity for danger and the capacity for control is what brings about the virtue. Otherwise you confuse weakness with moral virtue. I'm harmless, therefore I'm good. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. That isn't how it works at all. If you're harmless, you're just weak. And if you're weak, you're not going to be good. You can't be, because it takes strength to be good. It's very difficult to be good.
It's okay to hate trans people.
No, it's not okay, particularly to hate anyone, maybe even your enemies. And what I've talked about has virtually nothing to do in any real technical sense with trans people. The stance I took on Bill C-16 was an anti-compelled speech stance, and I stand by it.
Government.
Absolutely. There's never been a piece of legislation in the history of the English common law that compelled private speech. Not once. There has been legislation that compelled commercial speech. So, for example, if you sell tobacco, you have to put a warning on the product. But that's commercial speech. It's very, very limited, and even that's been extraordinarily limited. The Supreme Court in the US in the 1940s came out and stated forthrightly that there was to be no compelled speech generated by the legislative and the executive branches, that was unconstitutional. And it violates English common law tradition. And the fact that it has to do with transgender people is virtually irrelevant. The issue is compelled speech. And if it wasn't the issue, this would have died away. All this scandal surrounding this would have died away 18 months ago. It's not what it's about. It's about the government and the ideologues that are pushing this sort of legislation, attempting to exercise tyrannical control over voluntary speech. And that's a no-go zone as far as I'm concerned.
So somebody wants to be called Z or Zer. Why not?
I don't care what people want to be called, that's fine, but that doesn't mean I should be compelled by law to call them that. The government has absolutely no business whatsoever, ever, governing the content of your voluntary speech. Like, I don't even like hate speech laws. I think they're a big mistake. And that says what you can't say, right? This is what you have to say. That's a whole different ballgame.
So you were personally willing to accommodate people if they want to be called something odd?
We could have a conversation about that, and if I was convinced that you knew why you were asking that was actually in your best interest, and you weren't just attempting to exercise ideological control over me for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with you personally, then I might consider it in my private conversation, just like I would if you asked me to use a nickname, for example. So, but there's a big difference between privately negotiated modes of address and legislatively demanded compelled speech. It really has nothing to do with transgender people or, except peripherally, the transgender issue. It's complicated because the legislation that I objected to also writes a social constructionist view of human identity into the law.
Social constructionist? Nobody knows what that means.
It means it's the theory that underlies the proclamation that gender identity is only a social construct, is only something you learn, it's only a performance, that it has no grounding in biology. That's wrong. Now it's written into our law. I'm going right after the heart of the radical leftist doctrine. So it's no wonder they're infuriated.
The radical leftist doctrine, which is?
Well, partly it is that human identity is purely learned. And the reason that radical leftists believe that is because they believe that if there's no central human nature, then human beings can be transformed sociologically, politically, into the image that the radical leftists would prefer.
Which would be?
Oh, God only knows, the new man or some bloody thing like that. The sort of thing that the communists were touting back in the 1920s. The reshaping of society on an egalitarian basis with equality of outcome for everyone. All these unbelievably pathological and divisive and deadly ideas.
And so for challenging this, they call you a transphobic piece of shit.
Transphobic piece of shit!
Yeah, that's one of they've called me lots of things. Hitler, that was one. I was either Hitler or Milo Yiannopoulos, and that was one of which is quite the insult, eh? You're either Hitler or Milo Yiannopoulos. The bloody leftists, they can't even get their insults straight.
It's a little discredited now to say I'm a Marxist.
Yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you? Except I think it's 1 in 5 social scientists identify as Marxists. So yeah, it's a little discredited, but it's nowhere near discredited enough. It should be as discreditable to say that you're a Marxist as it is to say that you're a Nazi, given what we know about the absolutely deadly consequences of the implementation of Marxist doctrine. This is a real issue, is that we know the left can go too far. Everyone knows that. And there's a reason for there to be a left wing. The left speaks for people who are dispossessed.
They're speaking up for the weak. Yeah. Men run most of society. They're defending women. Trans people are often horribly punished, discriminated against.
Yeah, well,
so you're a bully.
There's no doubt that you need someone to speak up for the dispossessed, but that doesn't mean you get to play identity politics. And identity politics just invites a division into tribalism on the right and the left. Because the right plays identity politics too. I would say more in reaction, but it's not a good game. It's not a game that anyone will ever win. It's a game you play if you want everyone to lose.
Identity politics is a little vague for people. What's the harm? They're saying, shut up. You men dominate everything anyway. And you're just making it worse for weak people.
First of all, I think the idea that like men tyrannically dominated everything is a pretty damn weak argument. It's like you look around, I mean, I'm always amazed coming to a place like New York City. New York's an absolute miracle. It's impossible, this place, right? I mean, how many people come here a day? 7 million? It's fundamentally peaceful. Everything works, right? It's rich beyond belief. Everyone is doing better here than anybody has ever done on the face of the planet throughout recorded history. And the whole West is like that. And to call that all a tyrannical patriarchy is indicative of a very deep resentment and a historical ignorance that's so profound that it's indistinguishable from willful blindness.
You sound like a libertarian, are you?
I wouldn't say that I'm primarily a political person. I definitely believe that the West's idea that the individual is sovereign over the group is the greatest idea of mankind. I truly believe that. And I think it's metaphorically and literally true. And I think that if you don't treat yourself that way, and you don't treat the people immediately around you that way, and you don't base your society on that principle, that all hell breaks out very, very rapidly.
And how does this phrase, speaking your truth, fit in?
I have a rule in my book, which is Rule 8. It says, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. And it's really the last part of that, I think, that's better because, well, what the hell do you know about the truth? The truth is a very complicated thing. But people can tell when they're speaking deceitfully. You can tell now and then that what you're saying is actually a lie. It's a very good idea not to do that. There's a deep idea that's embedded in the biblical corpus, what would you call the narrative foundation of our culture. And the idea, it's laid out in Genesis, two fundamental ideas. And one is that whatever God is the force that uses truthful speech to transform chaos into habitable order. That's the fundamental idea, and that order is good. If truthful speech is used to generate the order, then the order is good. That's proposition number one. Proposition number two is human beings are made in the image of that power. And those propositions are correct, like they're correct metaphorically, they're correct psychologically, they're correct on multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. And so if you lie, then you warp the structure of reality. We know this. This isn't some metaphysical doctrine. The great scholars of the totalitarian systems of the 20th century, whether they are on the right or the left, point very, very directly to a relationship between the individual's willingness to subvert their own speech and to speak known lies and the totalitarian excesses of the state. Those two things are directly related causally.
Truth is better, but you talked about the postmodern, I'm speaking my truth.
There is individual truth. There's no doubt about that. I mean, you have your own experience and you can relate that in a way that's unique to you, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to inhabit a truth that's universal simultaneously, because otherwise we can't stay in the same place at the same time. There has to be an overarching conceptual framework that we all agree on, or we can't exist peacefully. So if you don't want us to exist peacefully, then you can demolish the overarching framework and let everyone revert to their own personal truth. But all that means is chaos. You can't even run a household that way. I mean, you have your desires and what you need in your household, and so does your wife and the rest of your family members, but you have to engage in continual dialogue to organize that into something that's collectively inhabitable.
Not if I'm speaking my truth.
Well, you try that with your wife and see how far that goes.